Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this keynote controversy discussion debate panel entitled Lessons from America, the New Culture Wars. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas, and I'd like to thank as well the people who are co-producing this session with us at the Institute of Ideas, which is the New York Salon. This is a very important discussion. The newspaper headline in the United States that's referred to in the blurb for the session said the culture wars is back. And certainly if you're in the UK or you're in Europe, you have a sort of sense of this kind of quite tribal split in US society. It's sometimes presented to us as a kind of Christian blue-collar versus liberal, progressive, secular over in America. And this sort of old culture wars being played out whenever people mention the terms abortion or gay marriage or the discussion around contraception and Obama's attitude to it and so on. You've got that, and let alone the kind of, I suppose, tensions between tradition and progressive thought. I say that is a kind of caricature because I don't think it's as simple as that, and I don't think that we want to leave it at that. And it's also not just a discussion about America. It's also one that we're beginning to hear, at least reflected in the press, that's happening here. So people will know that there is a debate about gay marriage, and that people, depending on where they stand on that, get labelled in all sorts of ways in that traditional way. You'll know that there's debates increasingly coming to the fore in this country that maybe we might not have anticipated around abortion. And it's then said that the reason why the abortion issue is coming to the fore is because there's a kind of Christian cabal advising David Cameron, the Prime Minister, and so on. So, what's going on? What does it all mean? We've got a really interesting panel to discuss this that will, dwell on everything from religion to gender and so on. One thing I did want to kind of warn, which is that there was an interesting spat in the British newspapers and I suppose on the British left, excuse the phrase, when Mehdi Hasan, who's kind of been considered to be something of a darling of the British left, wrote an article for the New Statesman and then the Huffington Post recently explaining why, as a lefty, he was anti-abortion, and then kind of got this kind of torrent of abuse from all sides who basically said, you can't be that, and now you're not a lefty, and he was kicked out of polite society. And then he kind of said, I can't believe I got so much abuse. I don't know what he thought was going to happen. But anyway, the point was, it was a kind of interesting spat about the kind of way it goes. And that's literally happened in the last week or so, but it's been something of a preoccupation in this country. So the reason I mention that is because regardless of the fact that I defend Mehdi Hasan's right to write whatever he wants, and I both disagreed with his stance on abortion but thought that the reaction to him was ridiculously intolerant, I was also struck by how thin-skinned he was. As we're dealing with some delicate issues here, I urge my panel neither to be thin-skinned or people in the room not to go into a huff and be offended by what they hear. If you're not offended, you're not listening. So I'm going to introduce the panel in the order in which they will speak. First of all, we're going to hear from John Haldane. John, who I've wanted to get to this festival some years, so I'm delighted he's here, is Professor of Philosophy at the University of St Andrews. He's the Chairman of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. He's the author of many books, but including An Intelligent Person's Guide to Religion and Reasonable Faith. He's sometimes known as the Pope's philosopher, to give you a sense of who he is. He also writes and lectures on art and has a forthcoming book called Seeking Meaning, Arts and Minds. Whereas it's John's first time at speaking at the Battle of Ideas, it's not Wendy Kaminer's. She's a regular invitee over from the States to speak at the festival because she always contributes such a rich amount of interest and depth to any conversation that we're having. Wendy is a US-based writer on law, liberty, feminism, religion, and popular culture. She's the author of Worst Instincts, Cowardice, Conformity, and the ACLU, and she's the author of another 7 books. She's an ardent civil libertarian, a fearless free speech advocate, currently serves on the advisory boards of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and the Secular Coalition for America. She assures me that she does not tweet. We all do if you want to, by the way, so you can tweet about her and she'll never know. Next up is another Battle of Ideas regular, Furedi, emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury, author of the fantastic book on education called Wasted, author of Politics of Fear. Importantly, for this discussion, probably the author of On Tolerance in Defence of Moral Independence. He's a regular media don, speaks all around the world, and is also an advisor to the Institute of Ideas in terms of our intellectual developments. We couldn't do it without him. We're delighted to have him on the panel. Finally, John Waters, who's a columnist for the Irish Times, Irish Mail on Sunday, and the Irish Catholic. He's the author of a book called Feckers. He's a bit of a Renaissance man as a playwright, a songwriter. He specialises in raising unpopular issues of public importance, it says in his bio, which is one of the reasons why we were attracted to him. Many of the people at the Institute of Ideas actually read his column in the Irish Times, so we're delighted to have him here. He's definitely not afraid to raise controversial issues. Okay, the speakers have 6 to 8 minutes. At 7 minutes, I knock on the glass and then you really start finishing off. John, give us your thoughts, please.
Well, thank you very much. A pleasure to be here. I'm going to present matters in a rather somewhat oversimplified way. Some mention has already been made of the kinds of ranges of issues that are central to these sorts of debates, and I'll come in a moment to the extent to which these debates constitute a culture war. But just to remind you, though hardly necessary, questions of sexual identity and sexual practice, questions of marriage and the family, issues to do with education and the arts, for example, questions of the place of a canon within culture, within education, questions of excellence in education, the whole set of issues around bioethics, questions to do with abortion, euthanasia, and now the growing set of issues around biotechnology, the ways in which it might be possible to improve human lives, involving oneself with the genetic base and such like. Now, how are we to think about these issues? I don't mean individually how are we to think about these issues, but how are we to think about this set of issues and the relationships that might hold between them? Well, I'm going to suggest there are 2 ways in which you can think about this set of issues collectively. One is you can see them, as it were, as a constellation. So there's a set of issues here that are being pushed and pulled by various forces. Some of the forces that are operating on some are independent of the forces that are operating on others. But it might also be, as is the case with a constellation of stars and planets, for example, or a constellation of planets, let's say that in fact there are some more general forces that are moving them around and affecting their orbits and behavior. And that might be true. So you might think of this as a set of issues that are related in that sort of way, and I'll call that the constellation view. But the other way in which you might think of these issues as being related is more organically. You might think of these issues as emerging either as fruits or pathological disturbances on the surface of an organism or a plant or something of that sort, and to see them related in a different and more intimate way as phases or aspects of a developmental process. Now, that second view, so we don't see them as merely connected by various common forces, we actually see them as connected more profoundly, more deeply, as part of a developmental process, is a view to which I am attracted, indeed it's a view to which I subscribe. Perhaps the most famous in recent times version of such a view would that be held, that's been held on the left, or a range of views held on the left, that come out of Marxism. I'm not a Marxist, but I am quite sympathetic to some aspects of Marxist analysis. I would see this as having deeper roots, as some Marxists would allow, in Hegelianism, and I see Hegelianism as having even deeper roots in certain notions of history, including notions of sacred history. But I'm inclined to see these issues as part of a developmental process. I think they have an underlying common root. And what I want to suggest is that the underlying common root is a debate not about, at the deeper level, it's not about these particular issues, it's about something very philosophical indeed. It's the debate between realists and anti-realists. That's to say, it's a debate between those people who think that the world, including ourselves within it, are constituted thus and so independently of how we think about it. As it were, there are underlying facts of reality. And our thought about the world and the kinds of values that we want to present and argue for have to be responsive to those underlying facts of reality. The anti-realist, in general terms, disputes that and sees what we call reality as being a human artifact, not so much artifact created by individuals, but created by cultures and so on. Now, if you think about it in those terms and then return to these issues, I think they can be seen in a new light. So questions of sexual identity and sexual practice can be seen as being partly a dispute between those people who think that there is an underlying thing called human nature and that provides the ground foundation for thinking about sexual ethics, sexual identity, and so on. Similarly, with regard to questions of, for example, marriage and the family, those who think of the family as a kind of natural phenomenon, naturally arising out of human nature, and those that think of it as being an artifact of certain kinds of social forces and institutions, and so on. And we could go through the different areas of that. But what I want to, just in defense of the idea that this is the underlying reality, the philosophical reality of that dispute, I just want to mention briefly two recent pieces of writing. One by the late Richard Rorty, in fact, more or less his last published piece of writing called An Ethics for Today, and I want to quote very briefly from that. But the other, a book that may not even yet have been published, but I think it probably has been now, called Mind and Cosmos, Why Materialism and Neo-Darwinianism is Almost Certainly Wrong. And this is a book being published by one of the leading philosophers in the world at NYU, New York University, Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel is an avowed atheist, a rationalist, and so on, but he thinks that there's a degree of bullying that has gone on in recent times over issues to do with intelligent design and such like, and he thinks that actually the neo-Darwinian materialist picture of the world is bust, it's broken, it's fallen apart, and in defense of realism, he wants to consider, as it were, how else one might think about these, and this has brought a torrent of abuse and criticism down upon him, and in the last couple of weeks, a couple of articles have appeared in in The Nation and other US magazines, really accusing him of betrayal and giving comfort to the enemy here being the religiously minded and so on. But let me quote, because time is short, I want to go back and quote from Rorty in Ethics for Today, and this is a very interesting passage. Rorty says this: "Is the Catholic Church right that there is such a thing as the structure of human existence, which can serve as a moral reference point? Or do we human beings have no moral obligations except helping one another satisfy our desires, thus achieving the greatest possible amount of happiness? Superstition," Santayana said, he's referring to another American philosopher, "is the belief that any legitimate ideal must somehow be grounded in something already actual, something transcendent that sets this ideal before us. What the Pope calls the structure of human existence is an example of such a transcendent entity. There is," this is now Rorty's view, "there is, however, nothing already in existence to which our moral ideals should try to correspond. The answer to the question, are some human desires bad, is no, but some desires do get in the way of our project of maximizing the overall satisfaction of desire. There is no such thing as an intrinsically evil desire." It's exceedingly interesting to me that Rorty, a very prominent advocate of this anti-realist position and so on, should have chosen the Catholic Church as being his target. And there's a reason for that, which is the Catholic Church is now the only surviving major institution in the Western world that holds to that broadly realist account of the nature of reality and the foundation of morals within that. And it's an interesting switch to Britain just now. Is this culture war going to erupt here in the way that it has in the United States? No, I think is the answer. America is a more idealistic culture. It believes in ideas much more than Britain does. The standards of intellectual debate are much higher in the United States than they are in Britain. There's a much broader representation of views within the academy and among the cultural commentariat and so on. But there is also this sense in America that they are forging a new nation, whereas I think that there is a sense in Europe that we are burdened by our historical past, and a very profound sense across Europe that the project of Western civilization is eroding and falling apart. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, John. That was really interesting. Okay, Wendy, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. I am older than I like to contemplate, and I can't remember a time when we were not in the midst of a cultural war. Culture is always in flux, and it always presses upon law. And successful cultural changes, or cultural wars, though we don't always use such martial rhetoric, result in changes of law. I think that probably the women's rights movement starting in the mid-19th century is an excellent example of a very successful cultural war. Now, I'm going to focus exclusively on the American experience. And at the outset, I want to stress that the culture war is not really playing that strong a role in the 2012 election. The economy remains primary. And I also want to spend much of my time here talking about some of the complications of what Claire, I think, rightly described as a caricature of the culture war in America. It is not simply tribal. Our cultural conflicts over social issues are actually fairly complicated. There are a lot of different divides. There are racial divides, sexual divides, ethnic, religious, generational, economic, and you won't find one monolithic group on one side and another monolithic group on another. Now, of course, I'm not denying that you have sharp divisions between conservative religious groups on the right and liberal religious groups and liberal secularists on the left, but a great many people fall in between, though they may fall left or right politically. Let me talk about a couple of specific examples. Take the conservative Republican Tea Party movement. It connects grassroots social conservatives with pro-business elites, many of whom couldn't care less about gay rights or reproductive choice. Social issue conservatives have a strong voice now in the Republican Party, less because of their numbers than because of their clout in the primary system, because of the way the primary systems work, and because the pro-business advocates are inclined to accommodate them, because as long as their social issue concerns are addressed, they provide ground troops for a low-tax, low-regulation agenda, and you can see that dynamic operating very clearly, I think, in the Mitt Romney presidential campaign. So again, we're not simply divided into these two cultural camps. The way we tend to be divided politically, in fact, political divisions tend to mask, political unities tend to mask a lot of cultural divisions. Take the gay rights movement, which of course is one of our more dominant controversies now. Gay marriage, especially gay marriage, has been steadily and even sharply gaining support in recent years. It's now supported by a plurality of Americans, according to the Pew Forum. Some surveys find it supported by a slim majority. And it's been gaining support across a cultural spectrum. It's been gaining support among blue-collar workers, for example, according to a recent Wall Street Journal poll. Now, there are racial and religious divides. Some of them are predictable. You have people who are unaffiliated religiously, generally strongly supportive of gay marriage. Evangelicals are generally strongly opposed. But otherwise, the religious divisions get a little complicated. A slim majority of Catholics, including Hispanic Catholics in the U.S., now support gay marriage. So the most dramatic divide probably over the gay marriage debate, I think, is generational, which is why gay marriage advocates tend to be really quite optimistic, because the younger generations, the coming generations, are much more supportive of gay marriage than their elders. And I think to the extent that we have a culture war, it is also in large part generational. Take the Tea Party, for example. Concerns about cultural decline are especially strong among the Tea Party. It's one of the motivating factors. And the Tea Party is dominated by older white Americans. It's also important to remember that during an election year, a lot of culture war issues are ginned up by activists, and they're not really necessarily representative of some bitterly, consistently divided public. Take the heated debate that we've had in the past year about contraception. Most Americans, including most Catholics, and these are very strong majorities, are united in their sense that contraception is morally acceptable. Contraceptive use is a non-issue for the vast majority of Americans. The Catholic Church, however, helped to make it into an election year issue when they sued the Obama administration for a rule that would require religiously affiliated employers to include contraception in their employee health plans. Now, the wisdom or constitutionality of this requirement is fair game. We can debate it, and in fact, it's since been softened. But the debate about it was shaped by a lot of political hyperbole about a totalitarian assault on religion. This is the U.S., not North Korea, one archbishop said. And, you know, he was right, because if the worst thing about North Korea was the fact that employers had to include contraceptive care in their insurance plans, then North Korea would not be North Korea either. Now, the public was supposedly pretty evenly divided on this issue, But it's worth noting that the polls show that anywhere from a significant minority to a slim majority of Catholics supported the contraceptive coverage mandate. And I haven't seen the polls, but I suspect that people of other religions were also reasonably supportive of it. This was supposed to be a war on religion, but it's not as if you had secularists on one side and religious people on the other. It's also, I think, important to note that this debate would never have occurred were there not a larger political debate about the Affordable Care Act. That's Obamacare, which is what this contraceptive mandate, which is not even new, it's been around for a few years and other laws, came out of. And that brings me to my last point, which is that cultural battles are generally battles over both culture and law, over moral ideals and rights. Of course, the gay marriage debate reflects different cultural and religious views of homosexuality and the institution of civil marriage, respectively. But at the same time, it is a legal debate. It's a debate about equal rights. Are there constitutionally sound reasons under the 14th Amendment to distinguish between heterosexual couples and gay couples in extending government benefits attendant on civil marriage? Or take the mid-20th century civil rights movement to abolish legally enforced segregation. It was obviously a battle for equal civil rights. It was also a culture war between people born and raised in and committed to a segregationist culture and people who idealized a culture of integration. Again, culture presses on law, but sometimes law presses on culture. And in fact, the civil rights movement was an example of law pressing on culture. It's why it was so violent. The segregationists, especially in the South, were violently committed to maintaining segregation. Integration came about under force of law and really force of arms. The civil rights movement was one culture war that lived up to its name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Frank, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think I'm probably in a minority of one in thinking that what we call the cultural war is very distinct, very specific, rather than merely a rerun of old debates and of old themes. And I want to spend a bit of time explaining how it works itself out, particularly in the European context, where it's far less crystallized. It doesn't have that kind of clear form as in the United States. I think what's very interesting about our culture wars here, and the fact that we even have a new term for it, is that many issues that in the past would have been controversial, but not that controversial, become elevated and become highly politicized, euthanasia being one of them. I remember from personal experience within my own family, people dying because of what the doctors have done with the acquiescence of the family. Nobody thought that it was necessary to have a debate about the rights and wrongs of euthanasia. At the moment I'm involved in a debate I never wanted to get involved in. I never imagined I would get involved in. I'm speaking in a number of European countries next couple of weeks, is the debate on circumcision. I mean, who would have imagined that people in Europe wake up one morning and they decide that they have the moral authority to tell Muslims and Jewish people how they should conduct their religious affairs? Who would have imagined that? Now it's become an issue, it's politicized, it's highly controversial. People have very strong views about it. Well, why? Where does it come from? Why is it that one morning, something that was a non-issue for centuries, sort of almost going back to the Greek times, all of a sudden gets inflated, becomes a major subject of political debates? I think that's what's very interesting. And from my own research and my own work, I think there are roughly 4 reasons as to what has changed that invites these kinds of arbitrary, politicized responses that can change, that can mutate. Things that we never heard about before, all of a sudden, become very important. People have strong views about it. They swear on the Bible that this is the most important issue since the beginning of time. And I think that's what's interesting about the cultural war. The first important thing that is interesting for me are the cultural insecurities that exist in Europe. I did a study for the European Commission a couple of years ago where we looked at what people were worried about. And I was really surprised to find out that if you looked across the range, it wasn't the big issues like global warming or terrorism or anything like that. They were essentially what we call cultural insecurities. And what they really are about is actually confusions about the normative foundations of life. The fact that if you talk to people about, what is the meaning of life, or what we used to call what is a good life, sort of what is the consensus by which our communities, sort of conduct their affairs, there's a lot of uncertainties, confusions, and people would basically indicate that this is what we think, and this is what they think, and I do it all the time. I mean, when I talk to my family members, I say, this is what the Furedis think, and those others have a different attitude towards life. It's a very new kind of reaction. I think those cultural insecurities are really very, very important, and they are very profound because we don't see them. They're not tangible. I mean, cultural insecurities do not come across as, I am a cultural insecurity in capital C, capital L. They're just there, and they're kind of a subliminal, sort of almost kind of routine, banal issue that we kind of confronted with. The second important development is the depoliticization of the public sphere. And I think that one of the interesting things that happens in intellectual life, in political life, is the fact that to some extent the public sphere is not a place where people conduct political debates. Elections tend to be not really about politics with a capital P. They're not about philosophy with a capital P. They really are either extremely utilitarian, very technical, very narrowly based. And it's not the case that there are significant constituencies of people who are captured by some kind of a political imagination, who are moved by some kind of political sensibility. And in fact, when you talk to even protesters and resistors, you look at the Occupy movement, you got to work overtime to discover even a semblance of politics. I mean, never mind anything else. It's really a politics-free zone, is the occupation movement. I think that's an interesting, and the fact that they even proudly avow the fact that we're non-political is an interesting development, that somehow we're not political is a sign of some kind of moral authority. So that's the second reason, I think, why we have culture wars. The third, and to me the most worrying development, is what I see as the ascendancy, or what I call, for lack of a better expression, the ascendancy of this totalitarian moment. If we cast our minds back into the interwar period, one of the most worrying trends that was emerging was this tendency to erode the distinction between the public and the private. In fact, totalitarianism, insofar as it means anything, it's about the totality of life being brought together, where people's religious convictions becomes the business of somebody else, people's sexual orientation, people's private lives. It's really summed up by the way in which both Stalinists and Hitlerites would encourage children to tell on their parents to the authorities. Pretty much the same thing that the NSPC does all the time. Here's a helpful line. Tell us about what your parents are up to, or what Sure Start programs do. We want to find out what's going on in your home. And there is a kind of sense in which we see a gradual erosion of the sphere that separates the two spheres, private and public. It takes on its most grotesque sort of manifestation on television, where you have all these TV programs, which are really about not your private life, not your public life, but it's the same, it's the homogeneity, where the announcer has the right, and in fact a duty, a public duty, to stick a mic in your mouth and say, John, how do you feel? Right? That becomes the moment. How do you feel? Because that's really our business. It's really the British public's business to know how we feel. In other words, even our internal life becomes drawn into this whole kind of dynamic. And I think that it's that erosion of the public and private that's the third important element. And the fourth, which is something that probably you all know about because it's the most public manifestation of this, is the politicization of identity, where increasingly who you are, how you define yourself, how you see yourself, becomes of tremendous importance. This is who I am, and that's the end of the discussion. A couple of weeks ago, I was giving a talk in Manchester, and this blind guy comes up to me afterwards, and he says, "I'm blind, and you better listen to what I say on this question," as if somehow not being able to see gives you this moral power that I got to defer to because that is his identity. And I got to say, of course, you're right. And the way in which identity is flaunted in our faces and becomes a resource that we kind of use to claim authority means that these four factors, when you kind of weld them together, becomes a really huge issue. And my prediction is that because of the consolidation of these forces, what is loosely called the cultural right is never going to win. I mean, they are really on a hiding to nothing into the indefinite future because they're trying to hold on to a way of life that is fundamentally at odds with the present moment. But those who are the cultural left are not going to win either because they're so internally confused and disoriented that all that they can do is to corrode and erode and to destroy. So what we end up with is a situation where it's a war where there's a lot of prisoners, a lot of casualties, but no victors.
Okay, thank you very much. John?
A cultural war would be a good thing. Normally, it is a good thing, and it's a necessary thing for society to have a conversation by which it sort of interrogates tradition, kicks it about the place, keeps the bits that are still intact, and adds the necessary new bits, and moves forward. I think the point is that this doesn't happen in the kind of discussion we're having, in the kind of cultural wars we're having, and I want to ask, that's the question I want to address. Why is that? Well, this kind of crucible in time, really, that this discussion, this particular cultural war is happening in the world, in America and in Europe, can really be dated back 50 years. It's from the early 60s onwards to the present. I think we're reaching the end of that phase now, and that's why perhaps the questions have become visible to us, and we're beginning to actually look at what we're doing as opposed to just doing it. There are many factors, I think, that we need to look at and to start paying attention to ask why did these particular set of conditions arise in our time. I think, always these discussions happened in the world, in societies. Always they happen in families. There's always a sort of a dynamic between parents and children in which the parents have a duty to be reactionary, so the children have something to react against. I feel as a parent I have a duty, a father, I have a duty to iron my jeans down the middle, so my daughter has something in me to patronise. So I think there's that dynamic in a society which causes it to move forward intelligently and coherently. But the problem is, one of the things we forget is that this particular discussion, these 50 years, has happened in the hall of mirrors provided by the media, so that we have become extraordinarily self-regarding about what actually each particular move and attitude that we strike has meant. So before we actually strike a pose, we look at the mirror to see how it looks. So more and more what we say has to do with how we look to one another as opposed to what we say means or what investigation we've conducted in order to verify it for ourselves. That's a big problem. The other problem is that there's a generational thing, whereby the generation which undertook this revolution in the beginning, in the 60s, in the name of youth, is still there, but it is now not so young. And it's in power. And I include in this myself, in a certain sense. We're all in power. And we have become convinced in our own minds that all of the ideas we had were so elevated and so perfect that they couldn't be improved upon. And unfortunately, this has created a sense among the younger generation that there is nothing to add to anything that we have already proposed, even if we haven't already completed it. So there's this sense of a program being implemented day on day, which really cannot be challenged by any kind of progressive mentality. And this is where we come to the interesting part of it. If you look at the language of this, the very words close the discussion down. I mean, conservative. Immediately you see somebody with dandruff. Conservatives molt. So they cannot win arguments. So the outcome of this argument is it's already settled by the time we started in these terms. The past must be overthrown because that's what the drama requires. That's what the mirrors will reflect to us. That's what's called progress. Progress is the defeat of what was there before. So that's a big problem. And the other big problem is that the young have been disabled. That the young who should actually have a contrary view to their parents cannot have a contrary view because their parents' view is perfect. So there's no space for new thinking. So they just replicate. And what happens is that it becomes more frenetic and antagonistic. They become more angry about and more insistent upon these. Now, when you actually look, what is at the core of this is a really deep problem. Because a lot of what we consider progressive is really just there are symptoms of a desire to, as I say, look good, without any reference to what we're actually changing. And the kind of analogy I use is it's like a circus big top, You come into the circus and it's this kind of space, but there's this terrible pole in the middle. And you think, this would be a wonderful space if only we could get rid of that pole. So you set into it with this chainsaw, which you happen to be carrying at the time, and you start cutting it down. What happens next? That's kind of what's happening with a lot of what we consider progress, because nobody has investigated what is the basis of the tradition which is being attacked. I see this in Ireland. I mean, Ireland is a fairly good society to look at things from because it's a small island and we have a lot of very strong tradition and we have a lot of kind of incoming We live off the splash, economically and culturally. The splash is, that which kind of feeds those animals who live halfway between the land and the sea. That's kind of the Irish for you. We'll take your dollars or your euros, we don't mind. But we'll also take your progressive ideas, and we'll dump all our old ideas in order to make space for them. At the moment, we have a debate going on about the Constitution, which is really about the family. In the context of children's rights, you'll be aware of this movement worldwide, and it's really the whole idea now. You see, children's rights is a classic example of an issue of that in the mirror looks really good. I'm in favour of children. So you see, how can you win this? By defending the tradition, by explaining the tradition. In fact, the tradition is very simple to explain, very simple to actually validate. It's an entirely different form of rights. The new rights are individualised. They're entirely to do with individuals fighting among each other for space. The old rights were about the cohesiveness of the society. The family was the molecule on which the family was based. Therefore, its rights were a nexus of rights, which related to the 1, 2, 3, the triangular relationships of father, mother, child. And that society, that depended on the functioning of that unit. Now, you bring individualization into that, you break it up. The problem is that if you are the individual who wants to break it up, say you are the child or the gay person or the whatever, the unmarried father, and myself, in my own personalised, individualised state, I'm an unmarried father. I want to attack the Constitution because it doesn't give me rights. Fine. But I have to accept also that the Constitution protects the existence that I have in another sense, that it actually creates the coherence of the society on which I depend, that the nexus of family rights at the core of it gives the cohesion which gives me the luxury of rebellion and revolt and dissent. And this is something which our society refuses to look at and refuses to think about. That, we have two interests as people, and many interests, but for example, we have a collective interest in the stability of our society, in the cohesion of our society. Yes, we have individual interests, but we mustn't we mustn't cut down the tent pole because it annoys us, because it blocks our view, our individual view. We must remember that if it do, it'll bring the roof down on top of everybody. So I think there's many things that we need to consider. Gay marriage, in that context, is a similar thing. I would make an analogy between gay marriage and what I represent in my own arguments many times, the rights of single fathers. There should be space for these individual rights, but they cannot be implemented at the expense of the cohesion on which we all depend.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so there's quite a lot of conflicting but sometimes complementary explanations for what's going on from the panel so far. I mean, just to kind of put it at its most crude, and I don't want to just get stuck on the gay marriage issue, but the way it's commonly understood is the reason why the issue of gay marriage has emerged is not because of the erosion between private and public, or even the politicisation of identity, or even an assault on tradition, but quite straightforwardly that as society's moved on, we recognise that there's no barrier to making people equal. Have you not all overcomplicated it?
Right. Well, I think that the problem is not in individualism. I think individual rights are really non-negotiable for me. And there's no problem with upholding individual rights, and nor is the pursuit of individual rights corrosive of social interaction, solidarity, anything of that sort. I think the real problem is a more fundamental one, which is that if you have an interventionist orientation towards the human experience, then you're going to all of a sudden invent all kinds of rights and demand all kinds of changes that are highly dubious. I mean, children's rights was mentioned over there, which is a weird idea, that somehow, children who are unable to act out those rights, cannot exercise those rights, are going to have these rights. And of course, when you scratch the surface, you discover that children's rights are really the rights of adults to act on their behalf. So it kind of empowers certain professional groups to do that. I think the gay marriage thing is also very similar. I mean, it's suggested that we're living in an unusually enlightened era where we're kind of discovering all kinds of things that never existed before, which is weird, again, given the fact that everybody admits that we've never lived in such dark ages for a very long time as now, where all kinds of superstition, all kinds of things are banned. But for some reason, here and there are these unusually sensitive, enlightened ideas coming to the fore. I think if you scratch the surface, it's like children's rights issue. It's to do with basically extending the intervention of the state and of public scrutiny into the private affairs of peoples and changing it around altogether. And I think that's really what's so dangerous, because the issue at stake is not the specific issues. The issue at stake is the broad pattern which gradually corrodes private life, gradually sort of erodes the distinction between private and public. And I think that we need to take a bit of a step back, and instead of having strong views on this, because the one thing we haven't discussed yet is that you can have this and that view, but we can take moral judgments. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with making moral judgments at the same time as we're doing this.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I think when Frank talks about the renegotiation of the public and the private, that he's right that that's sort of at the heart of this. Frank and I agree on a lot, but I think we disagree, for instance, in the example of gay marriage, on where that boundary ought to be set. And that boundary between public and private has always been renegotiated. There was a time when there were no laws against marital rape because marital rape was considered a private matter. I'm always puzzled when people say that trying to legalize gay marriage intrudes upon family life, intrudes upon private life, when the institution of marriage is a state institution. It's the state intruding on itself. One of the things that people often get confused about in the gay marriage debate is they think that it's somehow going to require churches and other religious groups to perform gay marriages, and that is absolutely untrue. That's not going to happen in the States. It could not happen in the States under the Constitution. We are simply talking about how the state rations out the rights of civil marriage to its citizens. There was a time when when some states would not allow interracial couples to marry. Now that may seem worse than anachronistic to many of us, but at the time there were people who believed, as fiercely as people believe now, that interracial marriage was tearing down the center pole, that God meant for the races to be separate, that interracial marriage was going to be the end of civilization. And I think not to recognize that is a failure of imagination. Now, whatever position you take on the morality of homosexual behavior or on the morality or appropriateness of homosexual marriage, and I'm not comparing discrimination against gay people to the history of discrimination against African Americans, but I am comparing the sort of process of cultural and legal change. Take children's rights. It becomes a very difficult issue in negotiating private-public boundaries when you think, for example, what's the right of Christian Science parents to deny their children life-saving medical care? When you think about assisted dying, one of the reasons that that's become a public debate is that the way the healthcare system is set up and the way our laws against drugs are set up make it very difficult for families to handle this now in private ways.
Well, I think the same-sex marriage issue is a complex one, but let me just try to locate it to sort of broader issues, as it seems to me. I mean, the issue about marriage and the strains under which marriage has come as an institution seems to me begin long before the question of same-sex marriage arose. So the trajectory of marriage, I mean, it was said a moment ago about, who owns marriage, where does it belong to, and so at what level should it be constituted. It seems to me that the institution of marriage as we have it in the West combines, I think, four elements. I mean, one is a question of an ethical bond. This is a little like exchanging promises and so on. One is the idea of a kind of metaphysical union in which male and female come together to create a new entity that procreates itself and so on. Another one is a legal notion, which is to do with contract and exchange of contract. And the fourth is to do with affirmation and public recognition. So I think it's an elaborate and complex matter. But those four elements came under strain long before the question of same-sex marriage came on the scene. The trajectory of marriage through the sort of iterations of divorce, and then in the Great Revolution of the 60s, the separation of sex from reproduction. So now you can have sexual activity without pregnancy, and you can have pregnancy without sexual activity, already changed the ways in which people started to think about the institution of marriage. But what I would say here is something that hasn't been mentioned thus far, is in a way it's implicit in what's been said, is the distinction between what one might think of as to be addressed or resolved at the level of claims rights of individuals. And when you spoke of equality, it seems to me much of this is put in terms of claims rights. And I think that once the notion of marriage has moved in the direction in which it had already moved, under the pressures of liberalization of divorce and the separation of sexuality from reproduction and so on, it was inevitable that people would start to issue claims rights and come in and say, well, can't we have that as well? I think that there's going to be a further claims right, which I would anticipate in the next 20 years, which will be the public recognition of polyamorous marriages. In fact, that issue is already with us. I mean, it's already in debate in some situations. But what I would say is that marriage should be thought of as part of the common good. It's not a subject of claims. It's a subject for society to take a view about what it wants marriage to be for. But just to illustrate the respects in which, just briefly, whereas I think it's going to come under pressure, same-sex marriage is going to happen. I don't think there's any serious question about that. What is then going to happen, and it seems to me the claim is entirely reasonable, is that somebody will say, for example, within the Islamic community, we already have polyamorous marriage. Why can't we have what the gays got, which was the last element of this, which was public recognition? So why can't we have the state publicly recognize this, as indeed the further issue which is already under discussion, which is sibling marriage? Why can't an incestuous sibling couple have the state recognize and publicly recognize the form of their union? And it seems to me it's not ridiculous to make those claims once you start to think about marriage in that way. Now, my own thought about this, finally, the state should get out of marriage. Just have civil partnership and the state withdraws entirely from marriage.
What I'd like to try and draw attention to is the kind of the senselessness which underlies a lot of the discussion that we have about these issues now. Even though we kind of insist that equality is a good thing and egalitarian, all these things are very positive and they sound great. But when you actually look at some of the questions and when you pose the questions, they can be very reasonably disposed of. However, the discussion is not reasonable because there's a huge anger and a huge personalization of the whole thing. So we have this reaction. Now, there are lots of senseless aspects of all of these discussions which we need to tease out. I mean, an example of the kind of thing I mean, not in this particular context, but just general. I mean, at the moment, we have quite a secular government in Dublin, which is trying to get the church out of education and secularize everything and so on. But they want to eliminate the figures 2013 from the number plates of cars next year. So it seems to me that there's a deep irrationality about all of their so-called reason.
I don't understand why.
Well, because 13 is an unlucky number.
Sorry.
So, and this kind of senselessness applies to a lot of this kind of discussion. And when you ask a reasonable question, what you actually get is you're accused of something. Phobia, of some kind of phobia. For example, a woman, a famous case in Britain some 7 or 8 years ago, Lynette Burrows, on a radio interview, she raised a very interesting question in the context of gay marriage. She asked, why is it okay for two gay men to adopt a young boy, but not okay for two heterosexual men to adopt a young girl? It's a good question. It's an interesting question. It should be a question that we have to get past in order to get to the next stage of the discussion. But what actually happens is the question is actually driven into the ground and buried. And the woman who made it along with her, because the next day she received a visit from the police. So, and she was investigated for homophobia or whatever is the equivalent, incitement to something or other. There are many aspects of it which we need to actually tease out, but we can't. I mean, marriage, is an institution. It's nothing to do, I don't want to refight the whole issue, but it's possible to actually say that, there is no discrimination against gays in relation to marriage because all people can get married if they can find somebody to marry them, so long as it's a person of the opposite sex, because that's what marriage is. Now, you might disagree with that, but you'll be disagreeing on a semantic basis as opposed to on a basis to do with the actual nature of marriage. And you'd be arguing on the basis of an individualization of rights as opposed to the old form of rights that I talked about. So I think that we need to actually have discussions which can actually freely look at these questions. I mean, I found it very interesting that when I was arguing for the rights of single fathers to have relationships with their children and to not be brutalised by family courts, in Ireland and in the UK, I got no support at all from the Liberals who want gay rights. Now, it's very interesting that they're interested in a very selective way in human rights. And I was recently talking to a group of students from France, and they had Googled me, and perhaps they saw my dandruff, but they decided that I was a deeply reactionary fundamentalist type of person. So we were arguing about these issues, and one of the things was gay adoption. And there was a young lad in the front row, and I said to him, okay, here's the deal. Next year, when you get your girlfriend pregnant at the age of 17, and her parents decide to put the child up for adoption, you won't have any say in the matter. You have no rights because you're not married to the mother. You have no fundamental rights, constitutionally or otherwise. So here's the deal. Your child is put up for adoption and is adopted by the gay couple across the road. And in 3 years' time, you're walking down the street and you know this is your child. But if you as much as look at this child, you will be arrested. Do you understand? Now, where is the fundamental human rights in that? And who's interested in those rights? You see, that's when I go back to the mirrors. Okay. We say things that make us sound good and look good, but we don't say truthful or reasonable things.
Right, okay. Points and questions, and then come back to the panel.
You mentioned America earlier on. I mean, surely one of the major differences is that religion is a much more of a major force in America than in Britain. And that Americans, in spite of some of the changes that you mentioned in attitudes towards gay marriage, that it's still a society where values and looking at life, arguably, I suppose, in more moral terms, is more sort of mainstream. Whereas in Britain, I think, on the whole, we are a much more secular culture, and we do sort of see things much more in a kind of mechanistic way. And that we have gone down the road of seeing everything in terms of rights, and that perhaps we do now see all kinds of what were regarded as moral issues simply in terms of equality and rights, and that this is kind of driving out politics and a kind of a cultural debate. Whereas in America, you still have that religious force, and you still see things much more in terms of what is right for society, rather than simply this idea of kind of equal individualism that does tend to drive out sort of moral questions. And I think amongst the younger generation in Britain, I think because of the way things are now, I think that increasingly they do see everything as about equal rights. And it does sort of effectively take out all these moral questions from the public sphere and just make everything much less interesting as a result.
It's a kind of thought and a question, really. I mean, I think that to move it away from gay marriage as our kind of example, and to talk about abortion, for instance, there's an interesting thing that seems to happen in Western societies, which is that people accept the moral contestability of a question in the process of arguing to change the law. But once the law is changed, any further discussion of the moral contestability of what has become now a right or an entitlement is rendered illegitimate. So it constructs taboos and traditions that are arguably more overriding and more kind of fascistic in their treatment of dissent than what went before. And interestingly, just as the example that sprung to mind about how this tends to happen, in this country, we have unusually liberal abortion laws, which mean that we're out of step with what happens in most of Europe, for instance, in terms of time limits, etc. And yet, discussion, be it at the level of the politician, be it Jeremy Hunt talking about his personal views about abortion, or be it at the level of the clinic and people trying to change women's minds and have moral arguments with people about not necessarily whether the law should change, but whether they ought to change their minds, is treated not as being a view that people disagree with, and not as being a view that the establishment or the community of scientists or whoever it is that you're engaging with find to be incorrect and illegitimate, but that it's not allowed, that it is somehow an affront in itself to hold that view. And I wonder whether, in a way, it's not a culture war anymore, but a cultural oppression.
Just wanted to raise a point. These days we have kind of instant global communication and increased globalization. And the fact that these things happen instantly, you can lead to misunderstandings, like the one you were talking about, Claire, and people jumping to conclusions and having knee-jerk reactions. And I was wondering how much of a factor this is in the increased polarization of these debates and what effect it'll have in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to first of all apologise for bringing it back to gay marriage, if only sort of momentarily. But that's not really what I want to talk about. Essentially, a group of friends of mine went out to protest against Anne Widdecombe and her friends for opposing gay marriage. It struck me as sort of, what is the point? And it left me thinking that the whole idea of identity, gay identity, it used to be defined by, in some sense, by oppression. There was a sense of identity was rooted in some sort of rightful indignation against injustice. And it seems as though, well, I want to ask really, particularly Frank, but the rest of the panel, is where does identity come from in an era in which oppression seems to be sort of so much less clear than it used to be? Oppression, sort of to sum it up, is a formal denial of rights to specific minorities. From that form of oppression, you can then sort of gain some sense of identity from that. I work with a trans group in the Midlands. I was struck by a couple of things. There was a recent big sort of argument going on Facebook, as it happens, about are drag queens allowed to be considered part of the trans community? Which brings up a couple of points, really, is that there are seriously trans women who are indignant at drag queens for, in their perception, sort of taking the mickey out of trans people. And secondly is the whole idea of community. You can have a group of people who cross-dress in secret and visit this website. No one knows that they're cross-dressed, but they can somehow be part of a trans community, even though no one actually knows who they are, etc.
While I appreciate Frank's argument about the erosion between the line of private and public, I was very surprised about the example about, children's rights, particularly when, the example compared NSPC children's line to Hitler's and Stalin's, authoritarian way of... It's totally an irrelevant, I think, example of it, while I appreciate, the whole issue that you discussed. Thank you.
Probably quite a lot of people thought that, but I'm so glad that you said it. So you can clarify me.
Somebody said on the panel that cultural wars are often good things, and I think I would have thought that at one time, in the sense that in the past it seemed to me the cultural war, as I used to understand it, was really a demand for freedom from tradition, and in some sense that was won. You can see that in the modern Conservative Party, in the sense that the cultural war, in a sense, was to say, I don't have to live my life by your traditions. And the Conservative Party today has given up on many of those traditions. You don't have to be religious, you don't have to be part of a family, you can live your life in a kind of free way. But it seems to me that culture war today is much more about not freedom, it's the opposite of that. It's telling people how you can't do certain things, you can't have circumcision, for example, and that's an abuse. So it doesn't seem to me it's about rights so much, it's about actually saying you can't have freedom, your way of life can't be tolerated, whereas once it seemed to me about a campaign for more toleration.
John, anything you want to pick up on?
Yeah, well, just on that one, I think that argument, you see, one of the things we kind of constantly do in these discussions is we conflate the individual context with the collective. And, of course, it's possible for each one of us to make all kinds of choices for ourselves. But if all of these choices are so divergent and conflicting, then we have absolute chaos as a society. So there's a necessity to actually have a general culture. The idea of the God thing, for example. Who knows what the consequences of removing God from a society is? As an individual, I can abandon God. I can decide I'm an atheist. I can live within a Christian society and benefit from all the collateral benefits which that Christianity radiates into the society. All the structural, moral hope, optimism, all of these things that it creates. I can breathe that in every day and I can call myself an atheist. But how real, how authentic, how is that position? And how tested is that? I say you need 2,000 more years from now to test it. And let's re-adjourn then in 2,000 years and see how that goes. You see, one of the problems with a lot of these discussions is the moral content that is entered into a lot of these discussions. The question over there about abortion, why does this happen? The content of much of our discussions now has got to do with moralism of victimhood. That by virtue of positing themselves as a victim group, somebody can acquire power to demand and have whatever it is they desire. So you have a kind of an inverted pyramid of power in a certain context. Not economic power perhaps yet, but certain kind of cultural power, whereby the more of a victim you are, the more powerful you are. I call it the omnipotent victim. Whereby if you are up against somebody who is powerless, then you actually you're going to be destroyed in a certain context. You find this in the context of say, family courts, where a white straight male is the most powerless person to walk into a family court. Whereas, if you're a lesbian or if you're a woman or if you're a child, then you actually can win, no matter what you're demanding. And the morality of the authorities, more and more the authorities define themselves by the way they extend this morality. And this is a real problem for justice in our society and for real equality in our society, because equality can't just mean new groups claiming everything from those who already have it. Equality has to mean equal treatment under every heading for every citizen, or it cannot mean anything at all. And it doesn't mean that. I found this again. If you go into
John,
equality...
quick.
I looked at the Irish Equality Authority's website and looked about what they were some years ago. We know what they want for women. They want everything. But what do they want for men? They want men to give women everything, essentially. That's more or less what they say. Men need to become more aware of women's equality. That's their policy on equality for men. So equality does not mean equality. It doesn't mean what it means in the dictionary. It means something entirely different.
Okay, I can feel that Wendy wants to come in.
I do. I wanted first to comment on what the first commenter said about America being a very religious country, and so we tend to speak more in moral terms than in terms of rights. I don't think that's true. America is a particularly religious country, but in many ways we are a very casually religious country. There are segments of the population that are quite orthodox or fundamentalists. There are large segments that are much looser about their religious beliefs, that may be affiliated right or left. It's not necessarily predictable. And what's interesting is that even on the extremes, on the right, for example, the orthodox religious groups speak in terms of rights. The Catholic Church went to court to litigate against the Obama administration, claiming that church-affiliated institutions had a right not to provide contraceptive coverage. And I don't think that was inappropriate. I disagree with them on the merits, but I don't think that was inappropriate of them. And what I find interesting is this sense that we should somehow separate the discussions of morality and rights, because I regard rights as the institutional or the justice system's construction of morality. The civil rights movement, people in America talk about the civil rights movement as being a great moral crusade, and it was, but it was also a movement for equal rights. It was a movement to apply the Constitution equally to a very large segment of the American public that had been denied rights in ways that many people considered deeply immoral.
Okay, thank you very much, Wendy. Frank?
I think that although we need to separate morality and rights, there is a very deep and profound problem where, in many respects, Britain and America are very similar in their moral illiteracy. I mean, they both suffer from a morality bypass in terms of public discussion, which does, in a sense, impact on all these discussions that we're having at the moment. I mean, just to get back to this children's point, you see, it is interesting. It's precisely because there's such moral confusion that you have this movement that assumes a moral authority, that they have the right to save Britain's children from their parents. And what I was getting at, I wasn't saying that the NSPCC is like Stalin or Hitler, because obviously they're not. But we do encourage a situation where we open up family life to greater and greater public scrutiny, and we encourage, sort of what is a conflict of generations within the family. We've got an expression in my field, sociology, called the dark side of the family. And when I talk to my students at the university, they all begin by talking about the dark side of the family. I mean, the only way we think of the family is that it's so dark, we need to open it up so we can see all this horrible violence and terrible things that are going on there. And I think that is a huge problem. See, the lack of moral discourse is a problem, and it relates to the point that the anti-abortion person was saying, because in one sense you're right. I think that there is a censorious, illiberal attitude. I mean, I'm totally pro-choice, 100% pro-choice, but I do find myself hostile to this presumption that somehow those people who are against choice they're moral inferiors, or somehow they are beyond the discussion, and therefore what you end up is a very kind of clumsy discussion. I think both sides are like that, and that's the tragedy, because I was always hoping that the anti-abortion movement would somehow argue a moral argument, instead of looking at little scientific embryos and saying science now shows us that this and that happened. And it is very sad when your opponents on the anti-abortion side are using the same arguments, essentially, that the people that they're arguing against. And I think that shows that when that occurs, you are going to have this arbitrary, ceaseless attempt to kind of create an identity for yourself, which is going to be the nub of the problem.
But can I just ask, because I need some clarification, because I agree that sort of everybody kind of does that technical thing, and yet abortion is used in sort of like a culture war sense as well. So ironically, there's a sort of technical shows you science, shows you evidence, and yet something seems to be happening that seems to be more like the culture wars. They just seem to contradict each other.
Well, they don't, because the funny thing is that although the culture war uses a moral language, it's a moralistic language rather than a moral language. And in a moralism, it kind of plunders science and anything else to kind of back up its lack of substantial arguments. And that's really the situation we're in. And I think that's ultimately what we're discussing. Can I just say one little point? we got to learn to make moral judgments more. I mean, we got to say, is gay marriage good or bad? Forget about whether it's legal or not. Is it good or bad? We got to assume and adopt that kind of language, and then we can have a more sort of progressive discussion. And I agree with what John said and what Wendy said, which is, let's get the state out of marriage altogether, and then we can all make up our own minds as to what we think is a moral way of human beings reproducing and then socializing their children and all the rest of that.
Okay, John.
Okay, well, very quickly. First of all, in the United States, when de Tocqueville went to America in the 19th century and wrote Democracy in America, he made two observations about America which are of enduring value. One is that America is not an individualist society, it's a community of communities. Put 2 or 3 Americans in a room, and it won't be very long before they've established some kind of association or community. Deeply communitarian peoples. But it's also a moralized country. Those communities are formed around certain common values, sets of values, and so on, and those may be diverse values. So it's a more morally pluralistic. The second thing that he observed, and he thought that this would be the strengthening of religion in America and the weakening of it in Europe, was non-establishment. It's not true there's a separation of church and state in the United States. That's nowhere in the Constitution. But what there is in the United States are the non-establishment clauses. And the result of that is you have a healthy economy of religious groups and others who are in contest over ideas and values. So I think America, that's the sense in which I think America is a much sort of morally more charged, evaluatively more charged, left and right, liberal and conservative and so on. I think that's a very healthy issue because these issues seem to me to be essentially and enduringly contestable. And this comes to the point that the gentleman made over there, which is I think there is an effort to try to close down debate. I think the current debates are, they exhibit some of the worst features of possessive individualism and capitalism. It seems to me the left, the cultural left, has become deeply bourgeois. It's very interested in attaining property and retaining property, and that property is control and command over other people's lives. I mean, it's classic because in a way it's exactly what Marx wrote about in the bourgeoisie in the 19th century, but from a different perspective. He thought they were after a material possession and a kind of power. I think that the liberal left has become desirous of control over the lives of other people, and one way it does that is by commanding the moral language. Can I just say quickly, the lady raised a question here about the effect of 24-hour news and one thing and another. Look, it clearly is the case that there's a premium on drama and movement. And so if you can have conflict in one thing and another, that is to the advantage of press and media and websites and all the rest of it. One of the worst features of debate, as I see it now, is the tendency to move from I disagree, and then you present an argument, to I'm offended. This emotivizing of the whole thing seems to me a kind of a degradation. I think it's getting worse, and I think that also, and finally, on the issue, so you take the issue of gay marriage, say, well, this is up to people what they choose to do themselves, but there's clearly the next wave is going to be affecting schooling, and particularly in the case of denominational schooling, and the question as to whether or not people should have the liberty to teach their children or teach children within the context of schools certain views about sexual ethics, and that will be the next battleground.
This year marks the 25th anniversary of the publication of one of the most controversial polemical broadsides in the culture wars, Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. How far do you think, both in the US and also here in the UK, things have progressed since Bloom's evisceration of the state of higher education?
Well, one of the striking things about same-sex marriage is that it hasn't really arrived through great public demand. Rather, it appears to largely have been an elite discourse, which most of us kind of agree to by default. And in that regards, I think one of the important things here is that the majority of politically active people today are a minority of the population. And that's why you end up with these very arbitrary laws and vagaries that, were described with, getting rid of, 13 in the number plates and things like that, because actually the majority are not engaged in these debates. Law ultimately has become arbitrary in a period in which the majority are not engaged in telling their representatives what they really want the law to be.
Claire, I thought you asked a great question about the confusion and the sort of grey, blurred area between sometimes is it a moral question you're actually tackling, or is it more of a sort of technical, procedural sort of matter? And that leads to a question I've been down to ask John. I love your stuff all the time in the Irish Times, John, and the Irish Catholic. But my question's about the children's referendum. I don't want to bore an English audience about the nitty-gritty of the details about the children's referendum. But here's my question. It seems to me that this referendum's happening even though all the legislation already exists to cover children's rights. Yet both sides of the argument, you on one side against, and the government and Liberals on the other, are getting very excited about it. But yet the vast majority of the Free State population aren't interested. Everyone's predicting the lowest ever turnout for a referendum. And is it not the case that what the referendum signals is people trying to define themselves, using the referendum as a moral marker, marking yourself out as I'm for children, I'm for children's right, or I'm for the family? And that leads me to basically ask, is it the case that, is this an actual example of a culture war? Or is this an example of people using the issue of children's rights to morally define themselves on one side of the fence or other?
There was a question that I wanted to ask you. Raised the thing of the 60s and the sort of reaction to that, particularly from the right, their cultural war. And I know Frank's written about this quite a lot, or did in the past. And I'm quite interested. I've noticed recently that there's a tendency now more to talk about the 70s almost in the same way, but from the left, as it were. So recently, particularly with the Jimmy Savile stuff, it's been like the 70s, oh, we can't go back to the bad old days of the 70s. And there seems to be some kind of something going on there whereby the left, the cultural left, is reacting to the 70s in that way, as a sort of almost as a reaction against the apparent freedom that was existed there, where people could just do what they want without being interrogated.
Yeah, I was taken with John Haldane's points about philosophical realism, but I'm not sure I agree that the Catholic Church is the only organisation which holds to realism now. And in fact, my reading of some of the argument for gay marriage is that it's philosophically realist. And I'm glad you raised it, because that actually clarifies what it is I find objectionable about it. I don't have an objection to gay marriage, but I would see it as the evolution of an institution which might or might not catch on. And I don't mind, because I'm an anti-realist, I suppose. But it seems to me a lot of people arguing for see it as the correcting of a historic injustice. They see it the state's responsibility to arbitrate and say, actually, this is the true essence of marriage. It's equal, it doesn't discriminate. And it seems to me that's a realist position. And I realise that that doesn't necessarily correspond to politics, but it does have implications for liberalism. Because I think, as someone else indicated, liberalism is traditionally seen as reacting against tradition. But actually, a lot of the need for liberalism now is tolerating tradition, old traditions, rather than trying to reinstitute a new norm of how society is supposed to be.
I was actually fascinated by John Haldane's remark that implied that marriage should be taken out of the business of the state altogether. And I wonder why that might be, because one would expect a natural law theorist like yourself to say, well, society has an interest in marriage, it's the cornerstone of society. So to hear it argued that actually the state should get out of it might seem paradoxical. I'm just quite interested in what the reasoning might be. I suspect it's either because if you introduce things like gay marriage and eventually polyamorous marriage, and I follow your line of reasoning there, you come to degrade the whole idea of marriage, such that it's better not to have that notion of marriage being regarded as being at the cornerstone of society, rather than the old-fashioned notion? Or is it rather because, since no institution can declare a union to be valid when it's not, I mean, that's a metaphysical or at least some sort of natural matter which can't be legislated for, best keep the state outside altogether and, in a sort of quasi-liberal way, let people get on with their lives in the way they want to?
David Lammy, the Labour MP, proudly said that there were more laws, criminal laws, made in the last 11 years than in the previous 100 years, which he said with great pride, and seemed to be a perfect reflection of how law is replacing politics, or law is replacing morality. And the question here seems to me that what we're looking at is law, and these laws don't seem to be based on freedom or freedom movements. I can't see a euthanasia movement in society. I'm not convinced there's a lot of gays suddenly decided we all want to get married, but perhaps that is where this process came from. But for me, that's not where it came from. It seems that the law is based more on distrust, because the gay marriage thing to me seems more like legally enforced tolerance, that it's more to do with homophobia or perceived homophobia than it is to do with this striving for rights. Similarly, euthanasia seems to be that actually, well, you don't really trust doctors and people to have the freedom to work these things out, so you need regulations in a sense. So it's less about freedom and rights than it is really about the development and further extension of regulation in society.
In this debate, when we talk about rights, it doesn't really matter in terms of what you agree with or not, but there seems to be a common view on both sides. There's a sort of rationality there, there's a proper argument. But recently, and the flip side of that, I asked a friend who's been here for quite a number of years from France what he thought about Britain. Now he's lived here for quite a while, and he said, well, it's the British state, and this is not a very political person. It's the British state. It seems like a father who doesn't know what he's doing. And I said, yes, that'll be the laws then, because all the new laws, those 11 years of extraordinary number of new laws, are all sort of seeped with the idea of the victim, very subjective laws, what the victim feels is wrong. On top of that, you have judges interpreting those laws. So, for example, some approve of smacking and let parents off, and others simply don't, and it just seems very arbitrary sort of power.
I was just interested in that concept of saying things that look good and sound good but lack real integrity and conviction that you were talking about before. Where does the panel think that we learnt this from, and why do we let people get away with it?
Frank, I really liked your point about how impoverished our moral language is. I mean, I think that leads into what you're talking about the breakdown between public and private, because when you've got a really incoherent morality, it's just going to sprawl everywhere without any sort of reasoning behind it. And I also think that sort of ties up some of the stuff you were saying with some of the stuff John Waters was saying about the sort of unthinking just attacks that we make on tradition. And that if we don't have a sort of coherent moral vocabulary, and we don't know how to exercise that, then everything becomes foundationless, and we sort of criticise everything without even thinking about it, and so tear down traditions.
It's very brief to start with the question about the Irish referendum. I mean, yes, exactly right. I mean, this is the people who have proposed this really see it as an instrument to attack the idea of tradition, not even the tradition itself, because they don't even know what the tradition means. I mean, most people who argue for this referendum haven't read the Constitution. I know this in debating with them, and they don't expect me to actually know anything about it either, because they think the idea is so axiomatic. Children. Who can be against children? So therefore, the idea that you are, and they can't, I mean, they try to demonize you as being anti-children, whatever that is, but it doesn't work. And that's kind of working all the way through all these discussions. There's a kind of a satire being conducted against the idea of tradition and the idea of authority. Without any consciousness, it's almost as if we kind of luxuriate on the idea of sawing through the branch we're sitting on, oblivious of the fact that we're actually sitting on it, and that when we have cut to a certain point, we will fall. This doesn't seem to have penetrated to anybody. I mean, and you can't get beyond it, because the logic of the victim is so strong. I mean, last year in Ireland, we had a presidential election campaign, and one of the candidates was gay. And a number of issues came up to do with some of the statements this candidate had made about paedophilia and Greek culture, and he was a great admirer of Greek culture and so forth. And then association with a convicted paedophile. And his defenders just tried to ignore the facts and accuse anybody who criticised him of being a homophobe. And you see they have this kind of, going back to Jimmy Savile, what we're actually seeing there now is the liberal leftist intelligentsia having to cope with the consequences of their own ideology in reality, because this guy suddenly isn't a priest and can't be demonized. He's one of them. He's a kind of a hip guy who liked to, have a nice time. Now we've got to kind of roll back, and we're finding this all over and over again, because human nature hasn't changed and will not change. So there's this satire, and because the conservative view is always dandruffed, it cannot defend itself. If you see a panel, I mean, RT, the BBC, RT, all these televisions, they choose their panels not to conduct debates, but to conduct dramas. This is actually a debate. I mean, we all have dandruff. It's a balance. But usually it's kind of like the liberal and the left-winger, and then the token reactionary, who looks like a reactionary. He wears a tweed jacket. He's dandruffed. He's molting, and he's a red face from alcohol. So, everything he says is obviously, and the drama is really to show him being defeated. So how do you defeat this? Well, you need a satire to actually, the Conservatives need to satirize this. And I have a wonderful idea for satire, which is my next campaign, which is I'm going to start a campaign for the right to marry myself.
Thank you very much. Frank?
Well, it's actually a little bit late in the day, because there's already a whole movement in England promoting solo sex, which I used to find a contradiction in terms. But my younger friends tell me maybe I haven't got the imagination to know what that is really all about. I think it's important to try to get a balance in this discussion, because it's a very difficult discussion. You go too far in a kind of Aristotelian sense, and you basically fall into nonsense. And you go in the other direction, there are problems there as well. It's important to realize that the liberal left, as it's called, and they're not a liberal left in my view, do not have a monopoly on censoriousness and on sort of being sort of very sort of intolerant. I think that it just so happens that what's called the liberal left is in a privileged position of dominating our media or culture, and therefore they're enjoying this role of being sort of soft totalitarians. I think the conservative right in previous times was just as intolerant, and given half the chance, they would adopt very similar orientation towards public discussion as their foes. So I think it's important to remember that. I think the moral authority lies, as far as I'm concerned, with people who are genuinely liberal, genuinely open-minded, and I invite you to adopt that position. And if you're genuinely liberal and open-minded, then you will, for example, when you hear Catholicism being attacked, as it is in many parts of Europe, you will be the first one to defend them and to argue against the double standards against which is directed at them. When I hear, for example, academic friends of mine talk about Catholics as if they're like a lower form of species, you do have to speak out and explain to them that actually, they are being totally morally illiterate, and they don't really understand that whatever you think about Catholicism historically, it's brought into this world a phenomenal number of intellectual, philosophical gains that we then reappropriated and used in the Enlightenment, humanism, and all the rest of that. And you don't just write off that whole kind of experience. And similarly, when you hear other sections of society being attacked, we have to take an open-minded approach. And I think what is beautiful about liberal humanism is it's consistent. It avoids double standards. It doesn't hide behind, not in this case. And it basically fervently and unambiguously upholds the importance of defending people's private lives, because it is private and it's nobody else's business, whilst at the same time being open-ended to future experience. It's prepared to yield to new experience. It's not going to tell couples who want to get married for this and that reason that they cannot do it because it's their business, whilst at the same time it will also morally judge them. And if it feels that it's wrong, it will say so. It will not fear offending them. And I think getting that right, that balance right, is really what we should aspire to, because it's the liberalism that we need in our society in order to open up the public space to a more grown-up political discussion and debate.
Thanks, Frank. Wendy.
I want to respond to the assertion that the gay marriage movement and maybe the gay rights movement in general is an elitist top-down movement. That may or may not be true here in the UK, I don't know, but it is the opposite of what is true in the US. In the US, it is a popular movement. It has now majority or plurality support. The politicians are following the public on this. And in fact, I think there are now 3, maybe 4 states in which we're about to have popular referenda on gay marriage. 1 or 2 of them may pass this time. If they don't pass this time, they will pass. But in any case, I want to stress that it is a real serious misconception of what's happening in the U.S. to call it an elitist movement. I also wanted to respond quickly to the gentleman who asked about where we have come since Alan Bloom published his book. I'm not going to comment on his book because I thought it was a not very well-reasoned diatribe, but I will comment on what I see as the state of higher education. I'll identify 3 primary problems. One is incredibly high cost. The other is incredibly top-heavy administration, which is partly responsible for the incredibly high cost. And the other is the proliferation of really repressive speech and harassment codes, which also in a way follows from the top-heavy administrators. A lot of them are what are called student life administrators, and they think their business is to do exactly what a lot of us here have been complaining about today, which is tell other people how to think, how to speak, how to treat each other, how to regard each other. And I really, this has been going on in colleges and universities and on American campuses for about 20 years now. And I really worry about the generations of students who are coming out of these schools who don't know how to engage in argument. And I want to second Frank's point that name-calling comes from right and left, and it really depends on who's got the upper hand at the moment. And it's extremely dangerous because it's attacking what I think is the foundational right, which is the right of free expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom of speech. And I think on some level, those rights are the rights that we are fighting about when we fight about these cultural wars.
Thank you very much, Wendy. John.
Perhaps I could just then take up that theme of illiberalism briefly and finally. I think we do inhabit an illiberal period, and I think that, ironically, much of that illiberalism comes from quarters that would see themselves as liberal. But that then tells us, I think, that the notion of liberalism has changed from the 19th century to the 20th century, and I could perhaps try to pick up a couple of points that have been made. See, the language of community, society, and state, for instance, once were pretty well defined, rather robust and proximate notions, in which there were really existing communities, really existing societies, and really existing states. But those notions have really come apart now, and people talk about communities under the most ridiculous contexts and circumstances. They'll talk about a such and such community. All that really means is an interest group, right? I mean, it's actually the importation into a cultural and social analysis of essentially a market language, right? A community, whether it's a gay community or whatever else it is a set of people who have an interest that they wish to pursue. I'm not against people wishing to pursue their interests, but the language of community is just ridiculous under these circumstances. And that, likewise, the question of society once meant something. Society now means so loose a notion of relationships, and that bears upon the answer to the question about why the state might withdraw from marriage, because the state doesn't represent a society any longer, and a society doesn't consist of a community any longer, and so on. With regard to the question of sort of realism and anti-realism, I don't want to go too far down that road now, but only to say this, that Mill in the 19th century, or someone to whom Mill was very close intellectually, though of course in other respects very far apart, namely John Henry Newman, had notions of liberalism robust and rooted in a conception of natural reason, a conception of human society, of human nature and such like. Mill spoke in one of his letters about the wise and the otherwise, and Mill's terror was that his advocacy of liberalism, of a high, principled, deep, philosophically rooted realist liberalism, would result in the rule of the otherwise. And I think that what I would say is the trajectory from that kind of liberalism to a kind of popular, deracinated, and this goes to the question of higher education, little knowledge is a dangerous thing. The circumstance we inhabit now is one in which the quality of public argument is very, very poor, and that's partly because the quality of higher education is very, very poor.
There were lots of difficult ideas and lots of things that I'm mulling over and thinking about during that session, but I really hope it moved things forward, and I've got lots of questions, which is a good thing at the end of a session. I did want to refute John's idea that, one, any of us ever thought he was hip, but on the other hand, I think that it's an indication of the spirit of this festival, but to correct you, John, because one of the things that has happened is there's been a lot of people who've been glad to bash the BBC over the Jimmy Savile affair, not least many of my Catholic friends who've thought, great, the BBC have been bashing us on this for ages, now it's time for us to have a go. But I can assure you the irrational, frenzied hysteria around the Jimmy Savile thing has to be stood up against as well. And exactly the same response happens, which is when I say everybody's got to calm down and not lose their mind, people say, so you're covering up for paedophiles then? So, you know, just because kind of like the people who were your enemies are having a hard time, no time for rejoicing. You have to be tolerant even of those who are idiots at all times. Thank you very much.